'Twas the season in December 1993 when we headed to Sydney, Australia to sail aboard the legendary FAIRSTAR. From the vantage of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, we captured our first glimpse of the veteran liner, which was berthed at the Pyrmont Cruise Terminal. For almost 2 decades, I admired the FAIRSTAR in my collection of brochures, so it was high time we met. Meanwhile, the exotic local fauna and our jet lag were constant reminders that we had come a long way from California. We hopped a local ferry for the short journey past the Circular Quay passenger terminal and our first ride under the legendary Arch Bridge. Our ferry whizzed past the sleek 24,000 gross ton FAIRSTAR, which by today's standards would be considered small. We disembarked in Darling Harbour, steps away from Australia's National Maritime Museum, where we had time for a short visit. At the time, it had an impressive liner exhibit where I was smitten with the lifelike model of P&O Line's short-lived SS Iberia of 1954. Unlike the Iberia, which was scrapped after 18 years, the FAIRSTAR was still going strong at 36 and counting. Nicknamed the Fun Ship, she's still considered by many to be the most beloved Australian cruise ship of all time. Our non-stop morning had worked up our appetites, but after boarding, we were disappointed to find only mediocre pizza available for a fee, which we washed down with a local beer. We headed up to observation deck, which was filling up with spectators, and so was the terminal. Perhaps that beer persuaded me to run ashore for some shots of our ship engulfed in streamers. And after all that, the view was actually best from promenade deck. Meanwhile, back up on observation deck, we couldn't have picked a finer day to sail past Sydney's historic waterfront. There's no doubt that Sydney's one of the world's most beautiful cities. We looked forward to exploring it a bit after our 10-night cruise. One nice benefit of the high winds on deck was to see the P&O house flag fully unfurled. Before much longer, Sydney was behind us, and we were entering the open sea. After catching up on rest the next day, I documented the Orchid Room restaurant, where we were seated at a table for 4 with a very unhappy couple from the outback. I actually preferred the forward-situated Palm Court restaurant, which had a large artwork reminiscent of the Aboriginal canoe aboard the SS Canberra, one of my favorite ships. We got lucky in that table 75 on the forward starboard side was not taken, so after a visit with the maitre d', it became ours for the rest of the cruise. Shortly after dawn the next morning, I began my documenting in earnest, working up the nerve to sneak out to the bow for one of my favorite shots. A vigilant bridge officer quickly put an end to that.
Excuse me, this is the bridge to the passenger on the bow. It's not allowed to stay there. Okay, thanks.
Well, on my way back to passenger country, I did manage to quickly capture the FAIRSTAR bell and the ship's Fairfield builder's plate. One of my favorite rooms aboard the FAIRSTAR was the Sunset Lounge with its aft-facing windows overlooking the pool. Actually, I'll be going into much more detail about the ship and her history in a dedicated decked video. And speaking of decks, the outer deck areas were coming to life late that morning as the FAIRSTAR cruised northward into the South Pacific. With the ship steaming at full speed, it felt especially windy on the unsheltered open observation deck. Now, is it just me, or did the starboard steam whistle, the one that actually functioned, look smaller than its silent counterpart? The dual-level Zodiac lounge was FAIRSTAR's main showroom. The lower level tended to fill quickly before the shows because the views from the upper level were challenged at best. But at least the upper level had its own bar and a nice selection of Arne Jacobsen swan chairs, which my untrained eyes had yet to appreciate back in 1993. There was a nice bridge tour that afternoon, but unfortunately no video was allowed in the wheelhouse, so I took as much footage as I could from the wings. And then, after a busy day of documenting, I put the cameras to rest. On the third day, we watched as FAIRSTAR took on the pilot to enter the Boulari-Havannah passage. Off in the distance lay the far less fortunate Ever Prosperity, which was wrecked on a reef in 1970. And that scenic little coral atoll with the tall lighthouse is Amedee Island, which guards the entrance to the passage. For a fleeting moment, we took in the view from the starboard wing, then headed back up top as FAIRSTAR approached the shores of New Caledonia. The passage is a convenient shortcut for ships sailing between Australia and our first port of call, Vila, in Vanuatu. After lunch, we watched from the shelter of Promenade Deck and then on the open observation deck as our ship navigated the passage. We then headed to our outside triple cabin down on C deck to switch gear for an afternoon workout. Although located in the ship's bowels near the waterline, it was actually one of FAIRSTAR's better cabins, keeping in mind that she was a glorified emigrant ship. We had an ensuite sink, a nice porthole, a dresser, and 3 closets for our clothes and camera gear. Fittingly, during that cruise, I was reading Australian-based author Peter Plowman's From Emigrant Ships to Luxury Liners that I purchased at the Maritime Museum. No doubt that today the loo, with its stained tile, cramped shower, and toilet area, wouldn't pass muster, but it was fine for what it was. All in all, we made the most of our basic home for 10 days aboard the good old FAIRSTAR. Before hitting the gym that afternoon, we paid a visit to the impressive 2-deck theater down on D and E decks. And as you might have guessed, that gym itself was a little creaky, but at least there was one. Like I had seen in so many old brochures featuring long-since departed liners like P&O's Arcadia and Oriana, the quayside Vila was full of merchants and merchandise. Shortly after our arrival, we were off on excursion with some adventure-seeking Aussies. We were taken to a local village where we boarded canoes for a short, somewhat leaky cruise downriver.
We're gonna crash. Oh no! We're gonna crash.
At the other end, villagers wearing native garb simulated an attack before performing a tribal dance. We would next visit a tropical beach before returning to Vila. Perhaps next time we'll visit the wreck of the President Coolidge, which has been attracting divers since striking a mine in 1942. Back in Vila, we had a chance to get some views of the ship from a whole host of angles. Although she lacked the flair of other ships of her era, the FAIRSTAR was nonetheless an endearing sight. Even with the recently expanded afterdecks, the FAIRSTAR had pleasingly sleek proportions. And as an added bonus, Vila's crystalline waters gave us a nice view of her starboard underwater anatomy. As the local Vanuatuans packed up their wares, we returned to Australia's favorite fun ship. With most of our fellow passengers out on deck, I took a moment to document the Aquarius nightclub, whose aft windows peered into the pool, where sometimes someone actually peered back. Only a handful of locals watched from pierside as FAIRSTAR silently backed away and pivoted off. Her long, graceful bow gradually maneuvered itself into a westerly direction towards what would become the finest sunset of our cruise. Meanwhile, the aging ship's tired boilers couldn't refrain from belching a dark plume into the sky. We lingered on the fantail in a balmy breeze before heading down to dinner. The next morning, FAIRSTAR had anchored off Vanuatu's Mystery Island. There was no room in the back of the tender for optimal footage of the ship, so I ended up riding back for another try. After all, Mystery Island would always be there, but the FAIRSTAR only had a limited time left. By now, after that little bow incident, my constant documenting, and endlessly riding that tender, I'm pretty certain the ship's staff and crew thought I was quite odd. And you know what? I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, albeit with better gear and a more well-trained eye. Even that day, I was grateful to have spent most of the morning on a tender, since once on the island, I wasn't keen about all the dead sea snakes on the beach and the intermittent rain squalls. Back on board FAIRSTAR, we enjoyed our proximity to the sea as another day drew to a close. The next morning at Isle of Pines, New Caledonia, I enjoyed more tender photo ops, with many thanks to FAIRSTAR's deep 27-foot, 7-inch draft. This time, with no sea snakes and much better weather, we had a chance to enjoy a South Pacific swim. I took one final opportunity to document the FAIRSTAR in her tropical element as we tendered back to the ship. That afternoon, we headed back into the Boulari-Havannah passage. It was fun to watch as we overtook a blue container ship, but I'd prefer to think the view was even better on the opposing side. Another dramatic sunset regaled us as we neared the western end of the passage. And then from out of the blue, we were buzzed by an inquisitive helicopter. Late that evening, FAIRSTAR had tied up in the port of Noumea, where some of our fellow guests ventured off on a casino tour. The next morning, we took the island tour, which offered a panoramic view and a visit to the aquarium, where we had another sea snake encounter. Ours was the last coach to return to the ship, and after taking a quick shot, I was the last of the last to board before FAIRSTAR began her homeward journey. Quite by accident that afternoon, I came across the captain's table, which was actually in the officers' mess. Later, we had a chance to enjoy lounging on the boat deck promenade. Although sadly I've long since forgotten their names, we had an excellent waiter and wine steward. Our wine steward came to the FAIRSTAR from Holland America Line, where he served aboard some legendary ships.
Rotterdam. New Amsterdam. Old New Amsterdam.
The next morning it was a full-on FAIRSTAR Christmas as Santa made the rounds. The seas were picking up along with the celebrations as FAIRSTAR's entertainment staff lavished the ship's youngest guests in Christmas cheer. That night, there was a gala dinner topped off with baked Alaska in the Palm Court. The next night, which was our last aboard the FAIRSTAR, the Pacific definitely did not live up to its name, but the good old FAIRSTAR held steady and determined despite nature's fury.
Look how calm we are in here. Wow. Get the lightning right in the right-hand corner, left-hand corner. I'm very impressed with the ride of the ship. This must be the smoothest riding ship we've been on, I think. Or maybe the potatoes too, I don't know. Wow. Not do any better. Wow. Jeez.
We couldn't have asked for a finer day as FAIRSTAR entered Sydney Heads the next morning. The lighting was magnificent as we navigated the sheltered waters inbound towards Circular Quay. Fully dressed overall, we approached the historic terminal I had so often seen in photos with ships like Australis, Orsova, and Himalaya alongside. Judging from the crowds at the rail, even incoming ships were considered an event in Sydney Harbour. That afternoon we visited the Opera House, then headed back to Circular Quay as FAIRSTAR prepared to sail off, this time with a whole new complement of passengers. For a moment I didn't think we'd be able to squeeze our cameras through the crowds, but finally a few relented and we made it to the rails just as FAIRSTAR backed away. The proud ship captured the intermittent sunshine, first framed by Sydney Harbour Bridge, then the Opera House, before passing out of view.